Hi, and welcome to my first video. What I'm going to do today is show you the process that I go through to take my images out of the camera and make them into something that's ready to display as a print. Now, the piece of software that I use for pretty much 99% of all my post-processing is Adobe Lightroom. This is a great piece of software that I use for cataloging all my files. I use it for doing most of my post-processing. Sometimes I still have to go to Photoshop. I create my website out of this program. I do all my printing out of this program as well. And so what you can see on the screen is an image that I took at Tanilba Bay one afternoon. I took it at about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, thinking it's going to be a fantastic sunset, and there it was. It was this really nice, subtle sort of sunset. Now, you have a look at this image. This is as it came out of the camera. It's a raw file, so there's no adjustments done to it, and when I import it in such a way that there isn't really any changes automatically made to the photo. And the first thing I do, I will get a whole batch of images, have to go through, look at the ones I like, and I also have to make sure that the images themselves are correct. So the first thing I'm looking for is exposure, and I look at the histogram up at the top right hand corner, and I make sure that the graph on the histogram isn't butted up against the edges to say that the image is over or underexposed. I'd like this image to be a little bit more exposed. It's probably a little underexposed, but because the graph edges are still within the edges of the histogram, then it's still okay to use. And with processing nowadays, you can get over just a little of underexposure, and that shouldn't make a problem. What will make a problem is if you have an image that isn't steady, so that it's blurred because the camera's been shaken when the exposure occurred, or if it wasn't focused properly. So we really need to make sure that that's right, because that's an end to that image. It's not going to work. All the photoshopping in the world can't make up for an image that just wasn't taken right in the first place. So look at the bottom of the image here about where I focused it, and there's lots of detail. I can tell that it wasn't blurred. Look at the background of the image as well, and that's just as it should be. And you can see up in the top right hand corner here that it was a 3.2 second exposure taken at f16, so that's about right for the depth of field as well. There's a bunch of other information that you can get down the side, which is just really interesting. You see what lens was used, what ISO and program and all the like is in there, what time it was taken. There you go, 6:23. And also the GPS coordinates. One thing I really like about Lightroom is that when you shoot with a camera that has a GPS, it'll show you on a map exactly where that photo was taken. Interestingly enough, according to Google Maps, I took this photo standing in the water, which just goes to show how tidal Tanilba Bay is. So the first thing I do is head over into the Develop module of Lightroom, and the first thing I do is I actually correct some of the issues with the camera. The first thing I do is I apply a camera calibration to it. So I pick a profile for my camera and the lens that I used. Now the way that I get this, and you wouldn't have seen that there's a slight change in how the colours are represented when I added that, so I'll just undo that, and it's very, very subtle. So you see the blues will get a bit bluer and the orange gets a bit oranger when I apply that. And the way that I do this is when I first bought my camera, I went out and shot a color checker chart with it. So I'll show you the picture of it here. And I've got this little color checker chart, and it's got all of these colors on there, and those are printed very, 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 very accurately. They are a certain color. And what you do is you take a photo of this with your camera, you go and put it into a piece of software, and the software knows that, for example, this blue should be of certain red, green, and blue values. And it knows that for all of the little color patches in it, and the computer checks what actually came through the camera. So there will actually be some differences between what the image actually is and what the camera recorded. So by adding the profile, which is created by this process, to an image, it compensates for the differences between what the camera saw versus what was actually there for real, what colours were there for real. So I've applied that. The next thing I do is I'll at least look at applying a lens correction, particularly using a 22mm setting on my ultra wide angle lens. It means that there's going to be a bit of distortion. And you can see, for example, the horizon is actually curved. It's not straight, even though it's been aligned. It's a curve. And so I'm going to turn the profile correction on, and you'll see that there's been a big change. The horizon's leveled out, and I'll just undo that and then redo it again. The lenses are profiled by Adobe, and they put these profiles in here so that they know how to correct the lens in the post-processing. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to turn the vignetting correction off because I actually like the look of it. And quite often I'll turn this profile correction on, I'll have a look at it, and I might decide, no, I actually prefer it uncorrected. Okay, so I've got both of those on now, so you can see already we've made a little bit of a change to the image, and that is just to correct for issues in the camera, basically. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crop the image. First thing I'm going to do is make sure that the horizon's level, so I'm going to use the angle tool. I'm going to draw that across, and I'm not always 100% on the horizons when I do them, but that one was pretty good. So there's only the tiniest little change in angle required for the horizon there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at perhaps cropping some areas out of this image. So I really want the focus to be on the patterns in the sand that's in the foreground. And one way to do that is to just alter the balance of the image by putting a little less sky in. So if I crop the image down like that, and I just get to the preview, I get a lot more foreground, but I get a little less of the sky as well. So let's undo that. See what it looks like if I was to crop in some of the foreground. Let's have a look at that. So I put a bit more of the emphasis, a bit more of the focus into the middle of the image. So after playing around with it a bit, I'm actually happy with the way it was shot. I don't think I need to crop it. And that's not always the case. Quite often I'll set the shot up, take it, and then come and look at it in post-processing and actually crop bits of it out of there, because as much as I would like to achieve everything in camera at the time, I don't always get to, unfortunately. So the next thing to move on to is to look at the white balance. The camera is going to select a white balance when it's shot, but you can go ahead and adjust this in post-processing. There's a whole bunch of preset things here, and what this is doing is it's going to adjust the color balance of the image. And you've got temperature slider and you've got a tint slider, and if you decrease the color temperature, it gets bluer, and to me it looks colder. If I increase it, it makes it sort of a bit more yellow or red. It makes the image look warmer. I'll just undo that there. Next one is the tint. So we tint separately to the temperature. You add a bit of green, or you can add a bit of sort of magenta to it. The thing I like to use the white balance for is to create the feeling of temperature, and it was fairly cold when I went and took this photo, and it's fairly windswept, this little place. It's overcast as well, so I really do want a bit of a cold look, but I don't want the image to look really blue. So I might just decrease the color temperature ever so slightly, and I'm just going to increase the tint, which is going to keep a nice sort of purpley color into the sky. Make it still look like the greyish clouds it was. So if I go back over here and just go back, you can see that I've just created the tiniest little change, once again, in how the image looks. So I've done that. I'm going to look at the exposure. So the first slider is the exposure slider, which funnily enough actually doesn't change the exposure in the way the camera would change the exposure. It sort of changes the mid-tone points. So the mid-tone point in this image is certainly the sand. So I'm going to adjust this until I get the sand areas at about the sort of brightness level I want. And this is very much to taste. And I think I'll keep it about there. This has highlighted some areas of the image that I'd like to leave dark, but I know that some of the adjustments I can make further down the processing slider here will make that occur. Next one's the contrast, so this will change the contrast between the light areas of the image and the dark areas of the image. I certainly want a bit more of that. So I'll bring that up as well. So now we're starting to get a nice contrast, and you can see how the patterns in the sand have started to pop out a lot more than what they were before. Next one, the highlight slider, I'm going to use a little trick that I learnt from a website called the Luminous Landscape. And what it is you drag your highlights all the way down, and it's actually something that I don't like the look of, but now that you've done that, you go and move the white slider up until you get the white point that you're looking for. And what this does is uses the software to give you a whole lot more detail in the highlights in the image. So that's probably about the right spot there. I might just undo that just to have a bit of a squeeze. So you can compare how it was before. Go and redo those two adjustments. And I've got a lot more detail, especially in the foreground. And I've controlled these very light parts of the sky to make sure they're not too blown out or too distracting. During that process, I've skipped over the shadows, and I'm just going to have a quick look at to see what that's going to affect. And dragging that down gives us a really good effect on the darker parts of the sand, which, because I've sort of increased the contrast a lot more on the highlights and the white slider, that means that the sand details are coming out even better than they were before. The last one's the blacks. Shouldn't really need to do that. That's setting the black point in the image, and I'll just set that. And what I'm doing when I look at this is I'm really looking at the histogram, so I can see the point of the graph ends up butting right at the edge, which is basically telling me that there are some parts of the image in now that are completely black. I'm going to undo that, and actually I don't really like or need that adjustment, so I'm going to undo it. One thing that I'm thinking of the whole time is how this is going to print. I make my images for print. I also make sure they look good on a screen, but you can never make them look as good on screen as they will on print. And I don't sell images on screen, I sell them on prints, so I'll make sure that that's the one I get right. The print's going to always look a little bit darker. The dark areas are going to look a little darker, so I don't see the need to push that black slider all the way over to the left to make parts of the image perfectly black. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is go into the clarity slider. What this is going to do is it's going to adjust mid-tone contrast. I'm going to drag this up, and you can see it has a really good effect on the foreground, and it does on the sky as well. So I'll just undo that to see the amount of effect that that's giving me, and it's giving me about the right amount of effect on the foreground, but it's not giving me enough effect on the sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a graduated filter. So I'm going to open this guy up, and I'm going to put a filter over the sky, and it's going to have a bit of a graduation on it so that it doesn't look too abrupt. And when I make my filters, I by default have the exposure set a bit lower, so I can see where it's taking effect. I can drag it around and go, yep, we've got it covering the horizon just so. Now I don't really want to change the exposure on this, so undo that. Now I can set more clarity for the sky. So that's probably too much. That's made it look really dark, especially in comparison to the foreground. But it's giving me the right amount of detail. So I might do that, but I might play around with the exposure for it. So it's starting to look a little odd, unfortunately. And unfortunately you can't win everything when it comes to Photoshop. So I'm not going to accept that that sky looks that dark, so I'm going to undo the clarity slider a fair bit. I might add a bit of exposure just to compensate for that, keep the image looking nice and bright. About that much. About that much is right. By using this little switch here, I can turn the effect off, and I can see what difference it's made. It's made that sky a lot punchier. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Vibrance and saturation I'm not going to use. Those are good sliders if you want to make changes to the whole of the image, but what I prefer to do when I'm manipulating the colour is to use the sliders for each particular colour, and using this little widget here, I can move it around certain parts of the image, and it will adjust that part of the image. So I've got it over this little purple haze that's on the horizon, and by clicking and then moving up or down, I can increase or decrease the amount of saturation. So I'm going to increase or decrease the saturation of various colours independently so that I can get the kind of colour balance that I'm looking. So I'm going to add just a little bit to that purple so that you can see that there's this nice glow there. But let's say I go and crank it all the way up to 11. Now you can see that it's getting a little bit too much. I'll undo that. Now I'm going to adjust the blue, and I'm not sure if I want a bit more blue or not. I'll drag it back and see what that looks like. It's actually about right where it was. So I'll leave that there. Down in the foreground there's a lot of orange, so I'm going to adjust the foreground, see what that gives me. Alright, I might undo that and see the difference that's in there. Actually, I don't think I need that adjustment at all. I think I'm just going to leave it the way it is. What I'm also going to look at is going to look at the hue. By adjusting this, I can move a colour left or right towards different other colours in the spectrum. So I can move this purple so that it becomes pinker, or I can move it so it becomes bluer. I actually kind of like it where it was, so I'll undo that. Now let's look at the blue that's in the sky. So I can make it a little more lighter, or I can send it a bit towards the purple side of things, which is starting to look a little bit unreal. So I'm going to undo that as well. I'm going to look at the colour that's in the sand as well. See if I can get that to look a little bit more realistic to the sand that I saw at the time. In fact, dragging it a little bit towards orange, a little bit more orange, is creating a pretty nice effect there, so I'm going to leave that in. Last one's luminance, and this allows you to adjust just generally how bright various colours are, and because this sky is a little bit dark for my taste, I'm going to have a look at adjusting the blue luminance, and that is good. That's actually increased. It's made it a bit lighter. And another thing you've always got to check is you've got to check that making an adjustment to suit a certain part of an image doesn't have an effect in another part of the image you don't want to. So that sky's looking good now. Let's have a look at the reflection of the sky in the water. So let's undo that and let's redo it, see what it's done. I actually think it's made it a little bit too bright. So even though I ended up fixing the sky the way I would like, it's had a bad effect in another area. So I'm going to have to either just accept it the way it is, or find a different way to do it. And I'm not the kind of person who's going to accept something I don't like, so let's see what we can do by adjusting the sky a slightly different way. Now I've used this tab recently, and I didn't get the effect I want, so what I might actually do is I might go and adjust the luminance of the sky again to the place where I like it, and it's had an effect on the reflection of the water which I didn't like. So what I might do is I'll adjust that to where I want it, which is about there. Now I'm going to use the paintbrush tool so that I can select an area of the reflected water and darken that again. Oops. So I'm going to create a brush, and what you've got is the inside ring of the brush is where the full effect will come in, and then the outside ring is where there's a feather or a graduation on the effect that's going to happen. And I use this so you don't get solid lines of differing effect around the place. So I'm going to draw this in. It's really dark at the moment. It shows me where the effect's actually taking hold. but I'm going to make sure that what I do apply isn't so dark that you can obviously see what's going on. It's going to be fairly obvious when you watch it on the video, but when you stand back for this and forget that you know that there's that effect occurring, it's going to be very difficult to notice. So decrease the exposure just slightly, increase the contrast just slightly, and if I just delete this quickly to show you what effect's going on. Beautiful. The reason why I like this is because the way that the eye is drawn towards light parts of images and dark parts of the images, so it's very light down the bottom, there's lots of detail for you to look at. And then when you look further upwards in the image, you kind of initially skip over this part of the reflection here and go to the next light bit, which is the horizon. So you see that, and then keep looking forward, and you see the nice subtle colour that's in there, and then you look at the pattern in the sky as well. So by making this middle bit of the image where there's a reflection a bit darker, means that you kind of skip over it, and there's not really too much in that image, in that part of the image, for you to really look at. So I'm using the lightness and the darkness to really try and make your eye follow around. If that's effective or not, always love to know. I have to do what works for me, and I don't know if it's going to work for everyone. Okay, I kind of skipped over the tone curve. I don't really use that anymore. I don't find it particularly useful. It's a sort of a blunt tool. Split toning as well allows you to do add different color tones to the image, and I don't really use that either. The next bit's the detail slider, and this is where you adjust sharpening. Almost all cameras come with a filter over the top of the sensor called an anti-alias filter, and it's there to stop an effect called moire occurring in the camera. And I don't really see moire often, which means it works. It wouldn't really be a problem in the kind of photography I do. But the problem with this anti-alias filter is it has the effect of blurring your image. So to start with, even though I use good lenses and good camera, I've actually got to go and undo the blurring that occurs because of this. Now, sharpening is a bit of a misnomer because it's not going to be able to fix an image that is not sharp or taken correctly in the first place. It's just going to improve an image that was already taken in such a way to make the image nice and sharp. What I'm going to do for this is I leave the amount at 100. I never really have a reason to change that. Same with the radius, leave that at 1. I don't really have a reason to change that. What I'm going to play with, I'm going to play with the detail and the masking sliders. And what I'm doing now is I'm holding down the Option key, or to be an Alt key on PCs, and I'm going to click down on the mouse, and the screen's going to go like this. And by dragging this up and watching the effect, it shows me how much sharpening, how much of the detail is going to get sharpened. Because if you do this, make this adjustment just with the image up there, it's very difficult to see what's going on. So if I just let go of the mouse again, and wait a second because it's being slow, you can see that it's showing me which areas of the image are going to have what amount of sharpening applied. So I'll drag that up quite a bit because I want to see lots of detail in the sand. Now I'm going to look at the masking, and what this does is I'm going to hold down Option again, and it shows me the white areas are the areas of the image that are going to be sharpened, and the black areas of the image are the areas that aren't. And you can use this to control noise, because quite often if you have a noisy image and you sharpen it too much, you'll be sharpening the noise and you'll make the problem worse. Because there isn't too much noise in this image, I'm actually going to drag it down quite low, and this is going to increase the amount of sharpening that you get. And this has a real effect, so I'll just hit undo, and hopefully on the image you can see how much more sharpening has been applied, how much more detail you get out of there. So I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to make sure that I haven't had a really adverse impact on other parts of the image while I was doing that. So have a look at this part of the image. You can see there's a fair few areas that have been sharpened even though they don't have to be sharpened. So it means that this masking is probably set a little bit too low, so I'm going to have a look at that again. Just going to drag it up. That's going to decrease how much sharpening goes on the sky. The reason why I view the image at 100% when I'm doing the sharpening is so that I can see how it's going to look on big print. And on a big print, if you've done this wrong and you stand a meter away from it, it's going to look pretty bad. So the noise reduction, this image isn't particularly noisy. It was shot at ISO 100, which is the base for the camera I'm using. It was well exposed. I haven't put huge amounts of post-processing into it, so I don't need to play with that. 25 is actually the default for the color noise reduction for my camera and for Lightroom, and I just generally leave that as it is. There's no point decreasing. It's not really going to improve the image at all. And then go down to the bottom. Lens correction is already done. Effects here, if I wanted to, I can put some extra vignetting in, have an effect, something like that, or perhaps try and be a little bit more subtle about it. But I'm happy with the vignetting that I get just out of the uncorrected lens. And the camera calibration we did before. So now I'm going to sit back and think about this for a little while. And is there any areas of the image that I really want to selectively change? I want to use any more brushes to kind of highlight or darken bits of the image. One bit that I'm thinking of is this sort of light area of the sky here is kind of distracting. It's a bit brighter than everything else. So I might make another mask. So I'm going to just paint this in a bit. There we go. I can see where the effect's being applied at the moment because there's too much of it going on. Decrease that, and now I just might adjust the exposure just slightly. So that's probably too much, and that's about just right. So if I undo that to see the amount of effect that I've created, and then redo it again, you know, it means that that area of the image isn't as bright as it was before, and not prone to distracting the viewer. Normally what I do with my images once I think I've finished them is I go and go back into the library and turn all the extras off on the side. I zoom them in so that the computer creates a full-size preview of it, and then I zoom it back out again and have a look at the image completed. Next thing I'd do is I'd put this image in a collection on the side, and what I have in my collections on the left side of the screen is a bunch of potentials, and this is where I put images that I have done my post-processing on, but I'm just going to sit on them for a while. I'm going to think about them a bit longer, because quite often I'll look at this image now, I'll think it'll be great, it's perfect, but if I leave it a couple of days, I come back and go, actually there's some things wrong with it. I might even decide that I don't like it at all. I might end up even processing a whole bunch of images that are really similar from the same shoot, and at the end of the day I really should only be picking one of all of those similar images, so I get all of the ones together and I'll just pick the one that I like the most. Here's the end result, and here's a list of all the things that were done. Look at through this history column here. This is everything that I've done to the image, and let's go right back to the initial import. That's how it looked when it was imported. And I can tell you that that's not how it looked when I took the photo, but because I've taken the photo right and I've done just a whole bunch of really small adjustments to the image, the end product is something amazing. And it's exactly how I want it to be. And it also makes up for the difference that you get by a picture just being a two-dimensional representation of what is a three-dimensional space. And all of the other things that you don't get with a photograph at the time. Sometimes you've got to try and put those into the image to make it really effective. So, was it hot? Was it cold? Was it windy? Was there a lot of noise around at the time? Was it quiet and peaceful and serene? Was there a lot of activity? Or was it just a calm, peaceful space that might have been a little cold, a little stormy as well, and with lots of really interesting things to look at. So there it is. That's what's required for post-processing. And none of these things are particularly magical or particularly difficult. The way that I learnt this is through going around the internet, looking at heaps and heaps of articles, and watching a few videos. So if you want to learn more, then definitely ask me a question in the comments on the blog, or get onto Facebook and have a look there, or just go and have a search around the internet. There's loads of good resources about how you can Photoshop your images. And the last part of this is that this is my standard sort of processing. I don't really do much more than this. Occasionally I'll take panoramas and stitch them together and then apply this process to it. So when you buy one of my images, you know what process it's been through. I don't go and do anything drastic like paste skies onto images where the sky was fairly boring, or substitute other bits of different images, or clone out different parts of the image. I just work with what's there, and I make sure I take the picture right in the first place so that I can get a good result, and then go and just make a lot of really subtle changes so that when you put all of those changes together you get a big effect. Well, hopefully you've made it through this far. It's been a fairly long process, and it's probably one of the first times that I've ever sat down and worked out how long I tend to spend on each image. So thanks for sticking through there, and if you've got anything you want to talk to me about, either hit me up on the Facebook page or put comments into the blogs and I'll get back to you. Thanks.